Joining us on today's webinar, How Accessibility is Changing, Why It Matters, and What You Can Do. Our presenters today are David Wentworth, who is the Principal Learning Analyst here at Brandon Hall Group, and Chris Paxton McMillan, President of D3 Training Solutions and Trusted Consultant of eLearning Brothers, Interactive Advantage Corporation, and UAchieve. Chris has almost 30 years experience in training and development and HR, working in the fields of publishing, sales, telecommunications, oil and gas, transportation, gaming and hospitality, and manufacturing industries for Fortune 500 companies and SMBs. The last 20 years, her focus has been on distance learning designing, developing and delivering courses, thus the business name D3 Training Solutions. Design, develop, deliver. Chris is a volunteer with the Lectora Accessibility User Group and holds 2 degrees from Oklahoma State University, a Master's of Science in Adult and Occupational Education, focusing on distance learning, and a Bachelor of Science in Journalism, News Editing. She has also been an adjunct faculty member at Tulsa Community College since December 2000. I would like to extend a thank you to eLearning Brothers for sponsoring today's webinar. eLearning Brothers is an award-winning leader in custom training development solutions and corporate learning technology. Its widely used products include Lectora for e-learning authoring, Scenario VR for VR authoring, the Training Arcade for gamification, 3 experiential learning management platforms, and the world's largest library of interactive e-learning assets and multimedia. eLearning Brothers helps everyone create learning that rocks. Now, for those of you that aren't familiar with Brandon Hall Group, we are a research and analyst firm that empowers excellence in organizations around the world through our research and tools. A quick mention that enrollment is currently open for our Certified Learning Strategist certification program. You can visit certification.brandonhall.com for more information. Your participation in our surveys is one of the most crucial components of our research. So if you see any surveys on our schedule that you'd like to participate in, it's always greatly appreciated. All participants do receive a piece of complimentary research once the results have been analyzed. And again, you can visit our main website, www.brandonhall.com, and click on Open Surveys for the latest list. And finally, a few logistics. This presentation is being recorded. The recording and the slides will be provided to everyone within 24 hours of the webinar in a follow-up email. If you would like to ask a question for our presenters today, make a comment, engage in a discussion, please do so by typing it into the question box for our presenters to see. And finally, if you would like to download a copy of today's presentation instantly, you may find it in the handout section, also on your control panel. And without any further delay, I'll turn it over to Dave so we can dive right in.
Thanks so much, Melissa. And as I like to remind folks, please familiarize yourself with that question box. It's the only way you're going to be able to chat with Chris and myself today. So if you have any questions for us as we're going through, please use that box and we'll keep an eye on that and try to answer your questions as they come. We'll also have a little bit of time to catch up with any other questions at the end. As we had stated in sort of the title and the lead into this presentation, we're going to talk a little bit about accessibility and inclusivity and how those things intersect, what they are, why that matters, and some real actual practical strategies, thoughts, considerations as you move forward in some of your learning programs to really take these things into account. And I'll be the first to tell you, in the weeks that I've been working on this with Chris, every time we've talked through this, I've learned something new. So it's been a really incredible time spent, and I think everyone on the call will learn some things as well. Very handy stuff, so I'm looking forward to that, and I think you'll enjoy what Chris has to share. But to get started, before I bring in Chris's insights, I do want to start with some thoughts around the topic itself. And obviously, we're going to use some of our research here at Brandon Hall Group to illuminate some of the findings that we've got in this area. So talking about inclusivity, this has always been important, right? It isn't as though these things are now suddenly important and they weren't before. But what I have noticed over the last couple of years is a real surge in interest and understanding of topics like inclusivity for leadership. It's just the pandemic environment has brought out a lot of interesting dynamics in the workforce and has made the ideas and thoughts around inclusivity that much more important. So looking at our own research, what we find is the traits of an inclusive leadership, of an inclusive leader include these things that you see listed here. And this is important to talk about because as we get into more of the accessibility elements, you'll see why being thoughtful about these things translates into the way you build and create and deliver learning. But it's obviously being aware of your own biases and preferences, being able to demonstrate your cultural intelligence, being curious about others. So these are the things that we've found that make up an inclusive leader. And the research shows that 61% of companies, nearly 2/3, I guess, say that it's either important or critical for them in order to be successful to develop inclusive leaders. So it's a very important topic. And at this point, what I want to do is, Chris, just have you come in and you can say, hey, and give some thoughts around maybe some of the things you've heard or seen around inclusive leadership, because I know you spend a lot of time thinking about these things.
Hi, David. Thank you. Yes, I would say the recent surge in popularity of these terms, accessible and inclusive, has seemed somewhat as resulting in a blurring of what these terms mean, and sometimes I see them used interchangeably. But an inclusive workplace goes beyond mandatory and legislative requirements. They are enriched by personal differences and enhance the innovation and creativity of that engaged workforce. And are widely recognized, again, to help your employer be the employer of choice.
Right, absolutely. And that's really the key is to all of this is it's much more about those big picture items rather than simply ticking some boxes and being compliant with certain either regulations or rules or what have you. And the good news is too is that we ask, okay, how resistant is your organization to changing your strategies and your processes and behaviors so that your organization can become more inclusive? The good news is only 7% of organizations gave themselves a 1, meaning that I'm sorry, only 7% gave themselves a 5, meaning that they were extremely resistant to this kind of change. And you can see that the curve leans very heavily to the left here. So, organizations are open to this kind of change, and it isn't an overnight thing for a lot, but there are a lot of things that do have to change, from strategies and processes. And that's why we're going to talk a little bit about specifically L&D and some of the changes and thoughts that you can have during that process to really open this up. But those are some of the thoughts that we've got around inclusivity and how important that is to organizations. And we've seen it, especially in our leadership development studies, that those organizations that are focused on inclusive leadership tend to have more effective leaders and in general have more effective outcomes. Which then sort of brings us into, and as Chris had mentioned, the sort of distinction brings us more into the accessibility piece of the puzzle. And so for us, that's about, the ability for everybody to access, and as in this particular scenario, we're talking about learning, so being able to access learning. And so, we looked at in our research, and we actually did, in one of our inclusivity studies, we asked how well are organizations doing with developing people in the organization that have disabilities. And it's about 50-50, where you've got about half of companies are either already or planning to include mentoring opportunities for people with disabilities, so mentoring experiences that are specific to those folks. And then you've got another, again, about half say that they either are currently or plan to include developing, programs to develop people with disabilities. So again, learning programs specific to that audience. So, on the one hand, there's some progress here, but obviously the white space shows that there's a long way to go when it comes to this. And so when we get into this, and I think, Chris is really the expert here on this type of thing, but when we talk about bringing learning experiences to people with disabilities, or different audiences, that gets us into this idea of the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. And some of you may have heard of this, and you may have heard it referred to as WCAG for short, which doesn't exactly roll off the tongue, but that's what these guidelines are, and they're very, very detailed, and they go on and on and on. There's a lot of considerations and elements in each one, but the big picture is the idea about these guidelines is making sure that the content that you're delivering is perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust for all audiences. Right? And so, Chris, I know you talk a little bit about this later, but is there, just something around introducing people to the connection between accessibility and inclusivity?
Well, I would say I think I somewhat operate in a bit of a silo as I create a lot of accessibility courses and inclusiveness. But as an e-learning software trainer, we are seeing more developers wanting to learn how to develop for accessibility and how to make sure that they are including everyone and that everyone does feel safe. So I think that's a huge improvement as far as time goes over the last 20, 30 years.
Yeah, absolutely. And so there's, as Chris had mentioned, and we were talking about how it's much more than just meeting, recommended guidelines or complying with some sort of regulation. It's a much broader, bigger picture than that. And accessibility is a big piece of that too. If you think of it in terms of what we've seen in our research around the personalization of learning, which has been, again, another really big front in L&D, is how do we get better at delivering personalized learning at scale? We've seen how effective personalized learning is at delivering results and delivering outcomes. It's important to remember that when we think of personalized learning, it isn't simply just about making it relevant to the learner, right? So that the learner recognizes why the learning is important to them. There's this second piece to personalization, which is, and it's highlighted here, is that the learner is able to access that learning in a venue and a time frame that's best suited for them. And if you start to think of that in terms of accessibility, you start to broaden your thought process here. Whereas, I think a lot of organizations will look at that and they say, well, we've got it, it's on demand. You can access it on your mobile phone. So it is accessible in a venue and a time frame whenever the employee wants. But have we taken in consideration all of the employees in every employee group? And so in order for personalized learning to reach its full potential, that's got to be considered. You have to think of all of the audiences you have and everyone in those audiences.
Thanks, David. Yes, personalized learning is so important. The first thing that we all have to realize is that every learner is different, whether they are different ages, races, genders, whether they have specific content accessibility needs, pre-existing knowledge about your training content, or no experience at all. Every learner comes to your training with different backgrounds and expectations. Learners deserve an opportunity to have access to that knowledge. And that's why it's up to HR, training and development, e-learning professionals to know how to effectively deliver that content. And while technology, as David mentioned, has done a pretty good job of bringing the world together, we are doing things responsive. We can access courses through our phone anytime, day or night. It does enable content delivery on a broad scale. There's still some challenges to creating inclusive and accessible content. When I work with clients, I ask about their accessibility needs, and often their response is they don't have any employees that are blind or deaf, so they don't need it. And that may be the case in your workforce. So I would like to ask you all a few questions about your employee and or contractor base. And there'll be a poll in a moment so you can share your answer. But how many total employees work for your company? Once you have that number, what is 20% of that number? Of those total employees that you referenced, how many of them are over the age of 40? Then, of your total employees, how many of them are males? Now, obviously, some of these numbers are going to overlap, but please keep these numbers in front of you or have an idea. And we'll go ahead and post the poll. Is it under 10, 11 to 50, 51 to 100, 101 to 500, or 501 plus?
Yeah, this is great. We're doing the math, and give people a few seconds to work this out. Make sure we get a good representation of the group on the call here today. But we're getting some activity here, for sure.
And this isn't an exact science. I'm sorry we didn't tell you there's a math problem involved.
That's right. All right, we're getting a pretty good response right here. I think I'm going to go ahead and close this poll and we can look at the results. Yeah, they're not going to change too dramatically, I think. So I'll go ahead. Let me share these results and stuff. Seeing that now, but we got the biggest group is 42% at 501 or more.
Wow. Okay. Fantastic. So yeah, more than 50% of you guys, actually, if we say over 100, have over 101 that this could be affected on. So fantastic.
Precisely.
So using those numbers, now that you have that in mind, kind of how everyone, go ahead and skip the next one, sorry, how everyone is thinking about accessibility and why most companies need to be thinking about accessibility. So did you know, when I asked how many total people work there, what is 20%? According to the CDC, in the United States, approximately 20% of Americans have at least one disability. And again, most people, when I ask, they talk about the blind or, the deaf. There's so much more than that. For many, many years, I didn't reveal to people about my dyslexia. It is considered a disability. I kind of look at it as an ability because I had great tutors to help me work around it. So I'm usually really good at proofreading, but it's been a challenge. And that's something that many other people may have had to work with. When we asked about people over the age of 40, well, beginning in the early to mid 40s, many adults may start to have problems seeing clearly at close distances, especially when they're reading or working on a computer, which many of us do. This is among the most common problems adults develop between the ages of 41 and 60. The normal change in the eye's focusing ability will just continue to progress over time. And that's from the American Optometrist Association. And last but not least, how many males actually work there? Well, everyone sees color a little differently, and even monitors will display color a little differently, even those people who are not colorblind, but 1 in 12 men are actually colorblind. How much color do we use actually in our training? Now, as Dave mentioned, when we think about the terms, a lot of times they get used interchangeably. To clear up this confusion and understand the differences, we need a greater understanding of the terms, what they mean, where they came from, how they've evolved over time. Since accessible design is the older of the two concepts and probably the most well-known, that's what I'm going to start with. And Dave mentioned that originally, David, when we talked about accessibility, and this concerns that structure and the containers that hold your information, the way your learners receive the information, and the way that your information is formatted and then presented. The World Wide Web Consortium, also abbreviated as W3 or W3C, actually develops all kinds of web standards, such as HTML for hypertext markup link, CSS for cascading style sheets, and they are the ones that developed WCAG, or the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, which I think comes off the tongue really easy. And these are just a set of formal guidelines followed around the world. These WCAG documents explain how to make web content accessible to people with disabilities. And within the training and development world, the focus is actually on Section 508, which is a set of 50 guidelines that we reference based on WCAG 2.0. Now, I would encourage everyone to read through the latest WCAG guidelines if you haven't. They really do provide a solid foundational understanding of a lot of the key concepts behind designing with accessibility in mind. But as you're reading through them, you also need to make sure you know your audience. Accessibility is based on a set of guidelines. Each individual company, each individual organization, they are going to need to determine which level they need to comply with. So an audience or an employee contractor analysis needs to be conducted to understand who the accessible learners are and what specific requirements that they actually have. This analysis will help you decide if your content needs to be A, AA, or AAA as far as your guidelines. And those are just levels of conformance. A being the lowest, and that is kind of your minimum level of accessibility, visual, hearing limitations. Your AA is your mid-range. again, going a little bit more in depth for maybe including things like dyslexia and the colorblind, and AAA is the highest. Now, I do want to point out that according to w3.org website, and this is a quote here, it is not recommended that level 3 conformance be required as a general policy for entire sites because it's not possible to satisfy all level 3 success criteria. So an example, I teach also at a local community college, and in that, if I have, for most of my content, it is just AA standards, but if I have a student that knows ASL and needs ASL or American Sign Language, then I would simply, that would be a AAA standard, and I would simply go to the university and get assistance with that. Okay, so that's where we mean you need to make sure you know your audience. We also need to be aware of the 4 types or areas. Again, most people think of visual being the blindness and hearing being the deafness, but it could also be things like low vision, colorblindness, glaucoma, again, near and dear to my heart, farsightedness, nearsightedness, and an astigmatism. So for hearing, it could also include hard of hearing and hearing loss. For motor, it references physical impairments, but as e-learning developers and HR professionals, we're concerned with the dexterity issues affecting the learner's ability to interact with that technology. So how do they interact with the mouse, or can they interact with the mouse? Do they use a keyboard? Do they need a touchpad, computer screen, and so forth? This could also include things such as loss or damage of limbs, arthritis, paralysis, multiple sclerosis, Parkinson's, cerebral palsy, all just to kind of name a few. And then the cognitive, which would be those learning difficulties such as Down syndromes, neurodiverse conditions such as dyslexia and ADHD, and what we've heard so much about recently is mental health problems like anxiety. So now that you have a bit more knowledge about accessibility, when you think of what accessibility means within your company, thinking of men over 40, 20%, who do you visualize as having an impairment? Has that changed? Do you feel you need accessibility in your content? And if you don't, let me bring up one other thought. Have you thought about temporary impairments? What happens when your best IT specialist breaks the right arm and they're right-handed? What do you do? Previously, you'd send them to training. Well, guess what? Training's all online and they can't interact with the mouse. Something to think about. When we think about any questions or anything coming in, I should probably ask that too.
Well, there is a question actually, Chris, but I think it's there's something that you're going to get to shortly about visually representing different people. So I think we're going to get into
Perfect.
that, and I'll bring that question up at that point. But thanks.
Beautiful, thanks. Not really going to go into the definition. I think we've all heard it, but to use a physical analogy on this, let's imagine a very old, very traditional members-only gentlemen's club with a grand old clubhouse that is hundreds of years old. Well, now let's say that club decided it was time to modernize in order to meet new accessibility requirements. And they took the time to fit wheelchair ramps, handrails, an elevator, hearing aid induction loops. And after all these alterations, the clubhouse would finally be much more accessible. But as a very traditional club that doesn't allow female members and has a substantial joining fee, could the club ever be really considered an inclusive space? The answer is no. So what do we mean by inclusive? Go ahead and go next, please. Accessible design, again, is concerned that everyone can hear, read, or see your message. Inclusive design asks that you consider the message itself. It requires a greater understanding and empathy and asks that you put yourself in someone else's shoes. Inclusive design is not concerned with the logistics of whether everybody can use it, but whether everybody wants to use it, and ultimately whether everybody feels safe in using it or taking your class. There are some questions that you need to ask, and inclusivity lives or dies based on the information itself and on your understanding and empathy with your audience. What are you trying to say? Are you speaking from a position of privilege? What points are you trying to make? Is your perspective clouded by bias, unconscious or otherwise? How will your message make people feel? Could your message or design be viewed as discriminatory or offensive? Is your view based solely on your own experiences, and does it exclude certain demographics or people? Okay. Okay. When we think about how we design e-learning for all those unknown variables, we do it through, again, inclusive practice and design. Creating a culture of inclusiveness is more than offering annual diversity training and hoping it makes an impact. Inclusive design concepts need to be thoughtfully included from the ground up. HR, training managers, e-learning developers, they all need to have diversity and inclusion on the top of their mind when creating, developing, or delivering e-learning or any learning. And that is because inclusive design isn't really a design practice, but a philosophy of designing, again, for one and extending to many, with the inclusive mindset goal of giving, again, as many people a seat at the table as possible with your course, and creating that best possible experience that everyone can and wants to participate in while feeling safe. Now, when it comes to inclusivity and diversity, my first and foremost point is that as a white cis female designer in an industry already dominated by white cis designers, if you fit that description, then the advice I want to offer you is to get comfortable being uncomfortable. As diversity and inclusion advocate Verna Myers says in her top-rated TED Talk, if you want to overcome your biases, you must walk boldly towards them, confront them, actively seek out conversations and situations that put you outside of your comfort zone. Listen and read and follow authors and designers that are radically different from you in all kinds of ways. Once you start embracing that change, immerse yourself again in that diversity, you will build teams that include people of all ages, genders, sexualities, from all kinds of backgrounds, cultures, and countries. And the more diverse our teams and collaborations are, the stronger and more inclusive our designs and our thinking will become. One of the best ways to summarize and define the content of diversity and inclusion is through one of Vera's well-known quotes shared around the world: diversity is being invited to the party, inclusion is being asked to dance. We want everyone to dance. So, what do I mean? What are some practices we can do here? Well, the first thing is to identify and remove biases in your writing. The general idea here is to remove as much bias, including, again, that unconscious bias, as possible. And to do this, again, you need a diverse group of people and perspectives that should be included in that design process. I want to point out, though, bias is natural, and unconscious bias can be overcome. The human brain is an amazing computer, and it is flooded with information about the world we live in. When presented with all of this information, the brain creates shortcuts. So if we are, especially as instructors and developers, aware of our own biases and countering stereotypes, we can reduce the strength and effect of that unconscious bias. Okay. We also need to talk about biases and diversity. Inclusion and diversity must be considered, again, I've said this several times, from the beginning of any e-learning project. Simply reviewing images or media isn't enough. We need to examine the way we actively promote diversity within our training, our marketing materials, and within our business itself. One that surprises people is when I ask about the diversity of their company. And some of the questions I ask are, what are the company's or organization's demographics? Do they have an equal split of men and women in their company? Are there any LGBTQIA2S inclusive? In case not familiar, that is the lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, and/or questioning, intersex, asexual, two-spirit, and countless affirmative ways in which people choose to identify. Do they employ impaired and/or disabled individuals? And again, where are they located? Because there are some differences there in how diverse things are. These are all things to keep in mind when planning, developing, and designing training. Okay. We are reading, let's go ahead and go to the next one there. Yeah, we are we're reading and seeing and hearing about this in the news a lot lately, visually representing diversity. People realize, and this is supported by research, that the media influences not only how others view them, but even how they view themselves and how we view ourselves. Adding diversity to a course seems simple enough, but we really need to avoid the trap of just adding photos of individuals with different skin tones and thinking we've accomplished inclusion. When selecting visual images, we also need to be aware of the situations and positions we put the characters in. Is every manager portrayed as a white man? What roles are played by those in the visual? Is anyone a token character? Are all the women subordinate, i.e. office staff? Are all the factory workers minorities? What about the dress? I think go ahead and click it 2 more times there. Is the dress gender-based with all the women in short skirts? Are there and should there be people with religious or cultural headgear or other clothing? The full range of human diversity, which includes things like ethnicity, race, size, ability, social economic background, gender, all need to be included. Now, I have been, as I mentioned, in T&D for almost 30 years. And in the past, it was challenging to find stock photography or video that appropriately reflected minority, ethnic, or societal groups that were not blatant stereotypes or disrespectful to individuals. Thankfully, I do want to point out, we now have access to training-specific image repositories like these that you see here from the eLearning Brothers stock library that contains a great wealth of diverse images. Their libraries actually contain more than 1.2 million items, and I added this part, and access to their libraries are included in a license of lector, or you can purchase them separately. Okay. We also want to make sure we're using our voice. When designing diverse and inclusive e-learning, we can increase the variety of vocal talent by ethnic group, age, gender, dialect, and sound. When we select voices, again, return to that discussion of diversity within the company. What characters or narrators do you need to include in your project? Do you have audio talent that sounds right for those characters? If your talent pool doesn't reflect the sound you're looking for, maybe browse through online audio websites. We see a sample here from voice123.com. There, what I did is you can filter by gender and age, and you can also post requests. But here I did a search for female with a Southern accent, and I found 79 results. Now, when you're addressing issues of inclusion, a request such as this with a Southern accent needs to include that you're not looking for a cartoon or overly exaggerated Southern accent. Fake accents are at best counterfeit, and at worst insulting. We want to use those authentic voices that will resonate power throughout every aspect of the organization. We also want to make sure we use inclusive language. This acknowledges diversity and conveys respect to all people. It is sensitive to differences and promotes equitable opportunities, but I do want you to remember that language is fluid, and therefore meanings and connotations of words can change rapidly. Some examples of inclusive language are pronouns. You may recall from the beginning, if you saw our screenshot there, when we introduced ourselves, next to it, it showed our pronouns. So I usually introduce myself as I'm Chris, and my pronouns that I use are she and her. Now, I do want to caution people on their phrases that they may think are inclusive but are not. And the phrases sexual preference or preferred pronouns are often phrases that are considered by many as offensive because it's not preferred or a preference. Please also use gender neutral terms like staff members, team, employees, folks, volunteers, visitors, members. And near and dear to my heart are family assumptions. Instead of assumptions about biological parents and assuming that there's a mom and dad, a more inclusive term would be guardian, parent, caregiver, grown-up, responsible adult, along with partner, spouse, sibling, and so forth. We also need to be aware that English language is challenging. We have a lot of English idioms and phrases, such as mankind or mailman. Those, of course, could be adaptable to humankind or mail carrier. And then slang, it's raining cats and dogs. This may need to be explained to international staff members and visitors because they're wondering exactly what you mean by raining cats and dogs. I've also heard some of my students say things like things are awfully good. Well, does this mean it's good or bad? It is contradictory and confusing, again, for international audience, and possibly anyone who identifies with being on the neurodivergent spectrum, such as Asperger's and autism. Last but not least, we need to be careful about our stereotypes. Use factual language rather than those value-laden words and phrases, such as old drivers are a liability. What's your definition of old? This can be reframed. Better to say something like, as we get older, sight loss may become more common, and as a result, driving may become more difficult. The biggest thing when we think about inclusive language is ask in advance if you're not sure of something. It's fine not to know something, but find out where to go to get those reputable answers. Okay. We also want to point out, as we mentioned, we need to focus on that bias-free inclusive language before, during, and after constructing our script, layout, and visual design, and why it's true that visuals are critical to demonstrating diversity within your workforce. The power and selection of words should never be underestimated. Words possess the ability to empower or debilitate learners in ways unintended by the writer. Guys, using this term to address all people is a gendered language that may insinuate that men are the preferred gender at your organization. Instead, again, uses gender-neutral language such as folks, people, you all, y'all, and teammates. Girl, girls, ladies, females, so forth. If you must use a gendered term for anyone over 18 years old, woman or women is a better choice. Terms like ladies, gals, and others can feel patronizing to some, and females sounds like a scientific designation someone would use for animals or plants. Another way or another term on here is grandfather or grandfather clause. This, people mean it has a way to exempt some people from change because of conditions that existed before the change. So we've grandfathered some users in an unlimited data plan, but the term grandfather clause actually originated in the American South in the 1890s as a way to defy the 15th Amendment and prevent Black Americans from voting. A good alternative would be legacy. Gypped. This is a racial slur for being defrauded, swindled, or cheated. And according to the Oxford English Dictionary, the term is probably an abbreviation for gypsy, a word commonly used to describe the Romania people. Don't use. Ghetto, another one near and dear to me. The creation of ghettos was a key step in the Nazis' process of separating, persecuting, and ultimately destroying European Jews. In America, the term became associated with poor areas, with non-white residents, and now it's a bigoted term that gets tossed around to mean low class. Again, don't use it. Handicap. Some disability advocates believe this term is rooted in a correlation between a disabled individual and a beggar who had to beg with a cap in their hand because of an inability to maintain employment. A better alternative here would be disabled. Housekeeping. In reference to office work, the language can feel, again, gendered, so maybe try maintenance or cleanup. An Indian or American Indian. This language dates back to Christopher Columbus and the naming of people on an Anglo-Saxon perception. This implies that these nations are only defined by how they were perceived by Europeans after 1492. Use the term either Native American, First Nations, or their specific tribal names like Cherokee or Choctaw. Lame, again, originally used in reference to people with reduced mobility, now is often a synonym for uncool. Both uses of that are considered ableist and should not be used. Master slave is a term often used in IT to refer to one machine that has the original copy of data and others that automatically update themselves to match it. Instead, try primary or replica, primary or standby. Peanut gallery, again, this term for heckling or unwanted disturbance originates in the 1920s, let me clarify that, when the peanut gallery was referred to the back section of theaters, which were the only places that people of color were allowed to sit at the time. The phrase was meant to poke fun at the idea of people of color engaging in intellectualism. Okay. Any questions or anything on the inclusiveness?
There was just another, question coming back to some of the WCAG stuff earlier.
Okay.
Is there a different set of guidelines, according to WCAG, around accessibility of e-learning authoring tools as opposed to the learner-facing experience, right? So, and I think you're going to get into some of these tools things, but as you do this, this question is asking, right? We think about accessibility often in the end result, right? The product that we're building. But what about the accessibility of the tool itself?
Great question there. And I am most familiar with Lectora, and I have a very dear friend that is he's 100% blind, and he develops in Lectora. I don't know if he's in it daily or every week, but he is an e-learning developer, and I'll reference him because we'll talk about the Lectora accessibility user group. So Lectora definitely is an accessible product. When we think about accessibility, the tools, the checklist, again, it's up to you. The most important thing a developer can do is, again, design with accessibility in mind. Knowing how to use the tools in your toolbox will be essential, of course, to your success, but Lectora is a very powerful authoring tool. With that power comes the ability of more than one way to do something, and not every approach is accessible. So when we're teaching things nowadays, I will often show many ways, and here's the preferred way to do it. So even if you're not developing with accessible, you're keeping it in mind because hopefully one day you will. Oops, the next here. When we think about screen readers, the two most popular screen readers, if you're not familiar, are NVDA, which stands for Non-Visual Desktop Access, and it is a free piece of software, and then JAWS, which is Job Access with Speech. And they are assisted technology, which is primarily used by people with vision impairments. What they do is convert text, buttons, images, and other screen elements into speech or braille. In addition to covering these items or converting these items into speech or braille, accessible content means your learners have the ability to do things like skip repetitive navigation menu. So they don't, every time they click a new page or a title, they don't want to hear about the course title, they don't want to hear the logo, they don't want to read the buttons for home, help, exit, and so forth. So you have to give them that ability. And that is something, it's referred to as skip navigation, skip to content, or just skip nav. And this shortcut, again, is huge for your end user. Now, whatever tool you're using, you need to understand how it works with your screen reader. In some tools or online projects, you have to indicate what an individual object is, whether it is a button, whether it is a photo, whether it is a text block. Lectora, thankfully, automatically lets screen readers know if something is an image. And what the software will do is after, so let's look at ELB logo, which I've highlighted here on the image on the screen. It would say ELB logo image. So it would add that word to the end. Truly, if this was accessible, I should have written it as eLearning Brothers logo, but I was doing a shortcut and shame on me for that one. It will also know when it sees, like here we have home, help, exit, that icon there tells me visually as a developer that it's a button, but the software itself automatically knows. So it would automatically add the word home button to the end. And sometimes I see people have to write in button home, button help, button exit. For Lectora, that would be redundant because then it would say button home button, button help button, button exit button, which would drive someone nuts. Anytime there is a text block, Lectora automatically knows, and in that case, it automatically reads the text that is within that text block. Okay. So that can save a lot of time. In addition to screen readers, we also need to remember keyboard navigation. Remember, I talked about those mobility issues. It means users must be able to interact with the course using only their keyboard, and again, referred to as keyboard navigation. So not using a mouse at all. This functionality mirrors how users navigate a web page, and they're completely, if they use keyboard navigation, they're completely used to it. They use a tab key to go forward and the shift tab key to go to a previous item. In Lectora, how we list things in what's referred to as the project or title explorer, again, I have a screenshot there on your page, is used to control the tabbing order of this clickable object. And it's based on the object's listed position within that project or that title explorer. I will say one of the biggest things to keep in mind here is making sure you have consistent navigation in your course. and hopefully throughout all of your courses. And that is so important, especially again for those using that screen reader or the keyboard navigation. The other thing I've got kind of highlighted here is it says set reading order to last. The back and the next button, you really wouldn't want them to skip over that each time, nor necessarily would you want them to read it, especially if you have it on the top of a page. So you can actually in Lectora specify that something is going to be set to last. So once they read all the content, then it will let them know, well, here's how I click back and here's how I click next. When you're searching for authoring tools, your authoring tools should include, and most of the ones that I work with definitely do, certain features to make creating accessible content easier and more intuitive. In this example, we see the Lectora use web accessibility settings that can actually be turned on and off at any time when you're developing a course. When this option is selected, Lectora will automatically enable certain features in the application that will assist you with meeting Section 508 guidelines and the WCAG Section 2.0 level AA standards. Some things that it includes is things like, you'll notice above it says language English. The language property settings for text field is now enabled. So this lets the screen reader know that a specific text block is different than the default language. So in this example, my default language is English, but if I had something that was set at a different language, it would automatically know to read it in that particular language. Alt tags, which are used to describe images, are initially set to empty. The video and rollover, audio skins and controllers are disabled. Always on top is unselected by default, which is a huge issue that a lot of times comes with screen readers. And again, there are visual indicators are enabled to display when an object receives focus, which you can kind of see on my screen. In the lower area, I show a focus color is orange with a width of 1%. An object receives focus actually through the tabbing, so that keyboard navigation, and basically a visual indicator is displayed, and that indicator highlights the object that is in focus, and it, again, you can define the color and the width of this anytime you want to, and customize it. As one of the other things that Lectora allows you to do is anytime during the process of designing and developing a project, Lectora's accessibility check tool can be run, and it's designed to catch any elements Lectora detects needs more attention. Now, please keep in mind this tool and any other automated tool should not be used as the final indicator in determining whether or not a project is Section 508 or WCAG compliant, because your requirements are going to depend on your particular company and your particular employee needs. There's no automatic tool that can fully accomplish what a person can do with a manual test. But in this particular case, the accessible check tool can determine if you have appropriately provided synchronized caption, or cannot determine this, but it can send you a reminder saying, did you I detect animations or videos? Did you set up captions for this, for closed captioning? And probably one of the favorite things within Lectora that I use that saves so much time and makes it so easy is the ability to create templates and library objects. Templates can save developers a lot of time once you have your course layout designed with your colors, your company fonts, how you want your alt text, kind of basically your style guide set up, maybe already with some accessible interactions and accessible quiz. You can go ahead and save that as a template and share it with your team. You can also redefine that as you go, again, continuing to make those updates available to your team. The other thing that I love are library objects. They are reusable without having to recreate the content, or if I remember, wait, I developed this in one class and I have to go back and look for it and copy and paste it. Well, if I know I've developed something pretty interesting, I can actually save it as a library object, and it's right there handy for me. And that can be a single object, whether it be text, page, icons, a set of objects, interactions. It could also be an entire chapter, section, or page. Now, we mentioned a little bit, I've kind of seen this page, but I've added one last sticky note here because I would like to invite you all to join the Lectora Accessibility User Group we refer to as LAUG. This was established in May of 2017 for the individual users. It's run by another individual user, Christine, and this is for the purpose of sharing questions, solutions, and ideas on how to program accessible e-learning in Lectora. The group does meet virtually January through October on the last Thursday of the month. It is free to be a member. And actually tomorrow is our last meeting until January. Within the eLearning Brothers Rockstar community, though, there's also an LAUG group, and this is a way for LAUG members to connect with each other outside the monthly live discussions. And last but not least in this section is we would like to give you all access to the eLearning Brothers brand new ebook, Making eLearning Accessible, that was released last week. We can see kind of the cover there, and I just wanted to show you kind of a table of contents. You can download this for step-by-step guidance on making e-learning accessible with WCAG checklist, problem solving, and strategies. And in writing this, we took it upon the status of, well, how do I do this? So how do I make a course keyboard accessible? How do users with visual impairments work? And really just kind of a Q&A provided actually in a handy ebook for you.
Awesome. So we did have some of those questions that came in, Priscilla. Go ahead and try to answer some of those for folks. Going back to one of the ones that came in, and I think we touched on this, but maybe we could talk a little more about visually representing people with different disabilities, right? So do you have tips on how to not just default to a person in a wheelchair, right? There's successful ways to show inclusion of different disabilities. And I think you talked about it a little bit, and I think also that's one of the things the Lectora group doing is, providing a wide variety of avatars and graphics to do just that. Am I right?
Yes, exactly. And one of the things, again, a lot of this may depend, people want to see themselves in the news, in the movies, just everywhere. So part of it may depend on what is it that your employees, your company has. Do they have people maybe with missing arms and legs? Are they have a lot of people in wheelchairs? And make sure to include to where everybody can again see themselves. And you can do a search, like I said, eLearning Brothers, they have, they have, last time I ran a check, and I know they just added 5 or 10 more, but last time I ran a check, they had over 770 individual people, and it's been a while since I've run that number, and each of them usually has about 45 poses, and some of them have a lot more in addition to video, so you can use them throughout your course.
Yeah. Is there a way, is there a way to run like an audit of the assets that you're using from the library to see how often they appear and things?
You mean, well, there's a way you can always look at the eLearning, like the eLearning Brothers sites, and I can see which ones I previously downloaded. As far as looking at any of the courses I develop in any of the software, I don't necessarily know of one. I, a lot of times, will keep a spreadsheet, especially if it's a series of courses that I'm doing for someone, and I will kind of list what character or what avatar that I'm actually using and kind of how I describe them. So, Bob may always be the manager, and, Susie's the supervisor, and, and so forth in that sense.
Mm-hmm.
I don't accidentally use them in a different course. It was like, wait a minute, in that course he was a supervisor, but now he's the a customer.
Got it. Another question that came in, and I think it's probably on quite a few people's minds as well, is Sasha's talking about one of the challenges I'm facing is pointing out how the lack of accessible content impacts the bottom line. Any techniques or studies to point to that can help with this?
There's several studies out there, and it's if we can make sure that we are being inclusive, it does a lot of things. It reduces turnover. If they've done studies that the employee inclusive and accessible courses, you have better retention of your skilled employees, which means lower recruitment costs due to lower turnover. A lot of times it will help in the attraction of new employees, especially in this age where we have people actually taking a stand for what they believe in and following their heart. There's a huge improvement in staff morale, which is, again, kind of hard to measure, but I know there's studies out there, along with a greater engagement within the workforce.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and from my perspective, I think it goes back to sort of what we were talking about at the beginning, drawing that line from the specifics of accessibility and broadening that out to the idea of inclusivity, right? So that we're making our content accessible, which by definition makes us more inclusive because we're providing those opportunities. And then there's all the benefits that we do know come from a more inclusive approach. And we have that in our research, and there's obviously lots of other studies out there, especially now around DE&I, diversity, equity, and inclusion, and why that's so important. I mean, it's become one of, if not the top leadership focus for leadership development, is how do we become better at that?
Exactly.
And organizations wouldn't be going after that as stridently as they are if it was simply nice to have. That's not to say that there's plenty of organizations that are maybe going after it for appearance, outcomes.
Right.
But in the big picture, that's probably not that bad of a thing. It's okay. It's a step. But the idea is to go beyond that and to recognize that. And we, like I said, we see it in our research, and there are studies out there. The organizations that are doing this, that are creating these more inclusive, more diverse environments, they're seeing better outcomes. They're seeing more innovation. They're achieving their business outcomes. So there's plenty out there, and you can draw that line. So if you think of a bigger arc, Sasha, than just strictly accessibility and its impact on the bottom line, because if you think of it that way, one of the first places and only places you might end up is just that, well, we won't get sued, right? So that helps the bottom line. If you start to draw that line a little bigger out to the more the bigger issues of DE&I, you can start to show more positive direct impacts on the business.
Well, and I think as developers, even if I have clients who say they don't need accessibility, the baseline, I may not include closed captioning for them, but still the baseline of the course is built so it's an accessible course. So hopefully when they come back a year, a month, or whatever later and say, you're right, we do need to switch this to an accessible course, there's not a whole lot of updates. I think part of that just comes to the best practices of developers in developing and being conscious of, the terms and words that we're using along with the images and such.
Yeah, we brought this up when we were talking the other day, but it's in the last minute or so here. I wanted to bring it back up. There's we work with a lot of organizations who are global, right? They have a global presence, whether it's their employees are all over, or they have a a network of contractors or whatever you have, but they're working and operating in a lot of different places, and so they have there are language challenges for these organizations, and there are entire industries around language development for businesses, right? So taking an organizational approach to language skills rather than leaving it up to the individual, they're taking an organizational approach to let's get everyone on the same page with basically business English for most organizations is what we're talking about.
Correct.
Right. And so you go back to some of the things that you were talking about inclusive language, exclusive language, idioms, slang. So often this idea of solving for any language challenges in the organization are very much focused on English as a second or third or fourth or fifth language, and not directed at the organization as a whole, even those people where English is the either main or only language.
Yes.
The same things that if we are truly looking to get the organization all quote unquote speaking the same language, everyone needs to be involved in that sort of thing, especially in a global audience where, like you said, a lot of the idioms that we use, and trust business people love to use idioms and slang to describe what they're talking about, realizing that that's not going to translate, your message isn't going to get across. So there's a big piece of that, I think, as well. So.
And I could give so many examples on that just with my college students alone. And that's one of the things often that they comment on. It's like, why are you being so particular on English and grammar? This isn't an English course, it's a business course. And it's like, but in order to get your point across and be taken as a professional and make people feel included and to show how brilliant you are, it's best if we all speak the same language.
Oh, yeah. I mean, in a global economy, the idea that a deal could be blown because the improper use of the language,
Yes.
trying to work with international clients. I mean, it happens all the time. So it's not just a, so I bring that up because I know a lot of organizations that operate globally are focused on that, and they need to take this piece into consideration when they do that. So yeah. So like I said at the beginning, I found a lot of this so fascinating. Some of the things that I hadn't thought about in my own work, that gave me some food for thought. So I really appreciate the time you spent with us, Chris, and bringing all your insights.
Thank you, David.
Absolutely. And of course, thanks to the audience for joining us and interacting and asking questions. We appreciate that very much. Of course, a link to a recording of this will go out to everyone, as well as a link to download the slides if you haven't already from the download section. And I just really appreciate everyone's time. And of course, thanks to our eLearning brothers for giving us the hour and providing your time, Chris. Thanks.
Thank you.